My mother kept her purse on the floor beside her chair. My father sat across from me with both hands pressed flat against the kitchen table. Neither of them touched the coffee I had made. That was when I knew something was wrong. My mother looked at my father before speaking. He gave her a small nod. "We need your help, Marin." I waited. "How much?" I asked. She swallowed. $25,000. For a few seconds, I honestly thought I had heard her wrong. 25,000? My father leaned back. "It's complicated." That was his favorite word whenever he didn't want to explain something. I looked from him to my mother. "What happened?" "There was a problem with the loan," Mom said. "Something we didn't understand when we signed the papers." I frowned. "What kind of problem?" My father explained that there had been changes in the payments, and that they were now facing a large amount they couldn't cover. He spoke slowly, choosing every word carefully. I listened without interrupting. The strange part was that only a few weeks earlier, they had told me everything was fine. They had talked about fixing the back porch in the spring. Mom had even mentioned replacing the old kitchen cabinet. Nothing about their situation had sounded urgent. Now they were sitting in my house asking me for an amount that could change my entire future. I looked at Mom. "Why me?" Her face tightened. "Because you're our daughter." The answer should have made me feel loved. Instead, it made my stomach turn. I had spent years learning not to spend money I didn't have. I had watched small debts grow into large ones. I had seen what happened when people kept borrowing to cover old mistakes. My parents knew that. They also knew I had plans of my own. Still, they were asking as if the money was sitting there waiting for them. Dad reached across the table. "We're not asking you to give it to us. We're asking you to help us." I pulled my hand away before he could touch it. What exactly would my money be paying for? Neither of them answered right away. Mom finally said, "The house." I stared at her. "Then show me the paperwork." Dad's expression changed. Just for a moment. It was quick, but I saw it. "We don't have everything with us," he said. "Then bring it tomorrow." Mom looked disappointed. Dad looked angry. I kept my voice calm. "Why didn't you tell me any of this before tonight?" Dad sighed. "We knew you'd make it about money." That sentence stayed with me long after they left. I locked the door behind them and stood alone in the quiet kitchen. Something about their story didn't fit. Then I noticed a folder sitting underneath the chair where my father had been sitting. They had forgotten it. I picked it up. I carried the folder to the kitchen counter and opened it. The first few pages were loan papers. I read them twice because I wanted to make sure I understood what I was seeing. The loan was not for the house. It had been used to cover debts connected to Blaine. I sat down slowly. There were payment records, bank statements, and copies of checks. Some of the money had gone directly toward bills from Blaine's business. I kept turning the pages. Then I found dates. The first warning had come almost a year earlier. My parents had known. For months, they had known they were in trouble, yet they had said nothing to me. I remembered all the times they had told me I was too careful with money. I remembered one Christmas in particular. Blaine had received a nearly new truck. I could still remember the way he smiled when Dad handed him the keys. My gift was a small card. Inside, Mom had written, "Maybe someday you'll learn to loosen that purse." I had laughed at the time because I didn't want to make things uncomfortable. Now the memory felt completely different. They had been helping Blaine while making fun of me for saving my own money. I continued through the folder. Then I found another paper. It was a written agreement showing that Dad had recently promised Blaine more financial help. I stared at the amount. My hands became cold. They were asking me for $25,000 while still planning to give Blaine more. Suddenly, the whole conversation made sense. This wasn't about one unexpected problem. They had been moving money around for months, trying to keep Blaine's problems from reaching the rest of the family. And now they wanted my savings to cover the whole. I closed the folder. For a few minutes, I just sat there. I wasn't angry enough to yell. I was hurt. That was worse. I had always believed my parents saw me as the responsible one. I thought they trusted me because they knew I could handle difficult things. But now I understood something I didn't want to accept. They trusted me because they expected me to clean up after everyone else. The $25,000 wouldn't even solve the real problem. It would only give them more time. I put every document back exactly where I had found it. I decided not to tell them what I knew. Not yet. The next morning, Mom called. "We need an answer soon," she said. "I know," I replied. "Give me a few days to look at everything." She sounded relieved. Later that afternoon, she came to my house. She hugged me tightly before leaving. "You're our daughter," she whispered. "I knew you'd do the right thing." I stood there after she walked away. Those words finally made something clear. They weren't waiting for me to choose. They were already counting on my guilt. I spent that night thinking about Blaine. Not about the papers I had found, but about everything that had happened before them. When we were teenagers, I had worked at a small grocery store after school. I would come home tired, finish my homework, and put part of every paycheck into my savings account. Blaine never stayed at a job for long. Whenever he quit, Dad would say he was trying to find something better. Whenever I saved money, Mom would ask why I was always worried about having more. "You're young," she would tell me. "You should enjoy your life." But when Blaine needed money, their answer was always different. "He's family." That sentence had covered a lot of things over the years. When I was 22, I was trying to finish college while working. I asked my parents if they could help with some of my school expenses. Dad told me they couldn't afford it. I accepted that answer. I worked more hours and paid the bills myself. A few months later, I found out they had given Blaine money to buy equipment for a business he wanted to start. I remember asking Mom about it. She told me not to compare myself with my brother. "He needs a chance," she said. I let it go. The business lasted less than a year. When it failed, my parents said Blaine had learned from the experience. Then he started another business. That one failed too. After that came a car loan he couldn't keep up with. My parents stepped in again. Each time, I watched them rescue him. Each time, I was told not to judge him. I never understood why being responsible seemed to make my life harder. I thought that was simply how families worked. The responsible child handled herself. The struggling child got help. Now, sitting alone at my kitchen table, I saw it differently. My parents hadn't just expected me to be responsible. They had used my responsibility against me. They knew I would think carefully before spending money. They knew I had savings. They knew I hated seeing people in trouble. And they knew I would feel guilty saying no. I opened my banking app and looked at my balance. $38,000. That money represented years of working extra hours, skipping things I wanted, and making careful choices. If I gave them $25,000, I would have only $13,000 left. My plans for a home would be pushed far away. And according to the documents, my money wouldn't even fix the real problem. For the first time, I didn't feel selfish for protecting what I had earned. I felt clear. I closed the app and placed my phone on the table. I didn't know what my parents were planning next, but I knew one thing. I wasn't giving them $1 until I knew exactly what they had been hiding. The next evening, I asked my parents to meet me at a small diner near their house. I wanted answers before I made any decision. They arrived together and sat across from me. Dad looked tired. Mom kept her hands around a cup of coffee. I opened my notebook. "Start from the beginning," I said. "What exactly happened with the loan?" Dad repeated the same story about the house and the payment problem. I listened. Then I asked, "When did you first learn about the problem?" "Recently," he said. I looked at him. "Recently as in when?" "A few weeks ago." I knew that wasn't true. I had seen the dates on the papers. I asked another question. "How much was borrowed against the house?" Dad gave me an amount that didn't match the document. I asked about another payment. He said he didn't remember. Mom suddenly looked upset. "Marin, why are you asking so many questions?" "Because you're asking me for $25,000. She shook her head. "You're interrogating your own mother. I need to understand what I'm paying for." Dad leaned forward. "You always do this." "Do what?" "Make everything about money." I stayed quiet. He continued. "Your mother and I are your parents. We're in trouble, and you're sitting here checking numbers." "I'm checking numbers because you want my money." His face became red. "You care more about money than family." I took a slow breath. I didn't want to fight. I looked at both of them. How much of this money went to Blaine? Neither one answered. Mom looked down at the table. Dad suddenly became interested in the window. That silence told me more than any answer could have. A few minutes later, Blaine walked into the diner. I hadn't known he was coming. He sat beside Dad and stared at his hands. Finally, he said, "Some of it went to me." I looked at him. "How much?" He gave me a number. It was enough to make my chest tighten. "What was it for?" He explained that he had another business problem and needed money to cover several bills. Dad quickly interrupted. "Blaine didn't mean for this to happen." I looked at my father. "Then why doesn't he sell some of the things he bought?" Dad frowned. "What things?" "The truck, the equipment, anything he doesn't need." Mom shook her head. "He's already under enough pressure." I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about it. Blaine was protected again, and I was being asked to sacrifice my savings instead. "I need time," I said as I stood. Nobody stopped me. I walked toward the door. Behind me, Dad spoke quietly. "If you refuse to help us, you may lose this family." I stopped. I turned around slowly. For the first time, I wasn't hearing a desperate father asking for help. I was hearing a threat, and I knew he meant it. The next morning, I went through the papers again. This time, I wasn't looking for the reason they needed my money. I was looking at what could happen if they didn't pay. One document made my heart sink. The house could eventually be at risk if the debt wasn't handled properly. I sat back and stared at the page. That house had been my childhood home. I remembered the hallway where I had learned to ride a bike. I remembered the kitchen table where I had done homework. The thought of it being lost hurt, even though the situation wasn't my fault. Then I noticed something else. They had options. Blaine had a newer truck. There was expensive equipment sitting in his garage. There were other things he had bought over the past few years that could be sold. I called my mother. Why can't Blaine sell some of his things? She didn't even pause. Because he needs them. For what? He's trying to get back on his feet. I looked at the papers in front of me. And my savings? She became quiet. We're asking because you're in a better position. That answer hurt more than I expected. I wasn't in a better position. I had simply been careful. That afternoon, I made an appointment with a financial attorney. I paid for the meeting myself because I didn't want my parents involved. I showed the attorney the documents I had. He explained that giving someone a large amount of money without proper written protection could leave me with very little if the money was spent somewhere else. He also warned me not to sign anything while I felt pressured. If you're going to help, he said, make sure you understand exactly what you're agreeing to. I asked what I should do if my parents kept demanding the money. He told me to keep records, ask for complete financial information, and make sure any agreement was written clearly. I left the office feeling calmer. I wasn't trying to punish my parents. I just wanted to protect myself. That evening, I made a list. I wrote down every debt I knew about. The loan, the payments connected to Blaine, the money borrowed against the house, the amounts I had seen in the documents. I placed the list inside a folder. The following day, I met my parents at their house. I put the folder on the table. If you want me to consider helping, I said, I need everything in writing. Dad picked up the list. He read it slowly. Mom stood beside him. At first, her face was normal. Then she reached the middle of the page. Her expression changed. She looked at Dad. He didn't look back. I noticed it immediately. There's something else, isn't there? Mom said nothing. Dad folded the paper and placed it on the table. I knew then that the $25,000 wasn't the biggest secret they had been keeping from me. Dad stayed quiet for so long that I knew he was deciding what to tell me. Finally, he picked up the folder again. There is one more loan, he said. My stomach dropped. How much? He gave me the amount. It was a private loan Blaine had taken out after his latest business problem. The worst part was that my parents had agreed to guarantee it using assets connected to the family. I looked at Mom. You knew about this? She nodded slowly. Why didn't you tell me? Because we knew you would worry. I almost smiled. No. You knew I would say no. Neither of them corrected me. Dad explained that the $25,000 would only cover part of what was due. So this isn't going to solve everything, I said. He looked away. No. I sat back in the chair. They had presented the situation as one emergency. It wasn't. There were layers of debt behind it, and they had chosen to tell me only enough to make me feel responsible. I looked at Dad. How much money have you given Blaine over the years? He didn't answer. Dad! He shook his head. That doesn't matter. It matters to me. We're not going through the whole history. That was when something inside me broke. I thought about every time they had called me cheap. Every time Mom had told me I worried too much about money. Every time Dad had said I should loosen up. They had watched me save for years while quietly using their money to protect Blaine from the consequences of his choices. I looked at both of them. You called me cheap because I saved my own money. Mom's eyes filled with tears. Marin. No. Let me finish. My voice was shaking, but I kept going. You made me feel guilty for being careful. You made me feel selfish whenever I said I couldn't give Blaine money. All those years, I wasn't being cheap. I was trying to build some security for myself. Mom started crying. We never meant to hurt you. I looked at her. I believe you may not have meant to hurt me, but you did. She covered her face with her hands. I waited until she looked at me again. I'm not giving you the $25,000. Dad's jaw tightened. I can't do that. You can, I said. You just don't want to. I explained that if they wanted to fix this, they needed to sell things they could afford to lose, work out the debts properly, and stop putting money into Blaine's problem. Dad immediately shook his head. No. Mom said the same thing. No, Marin. I stared at them. They had rejected every condition before even discussing it, and suddenly I understood. They didn't want a solution. They wanted my savings. For the next several days, my mother didn't call me. She didn't answer my messages either. My father was different. He left angry voicemails almost every night. You're abandoning your own family. You know what happens if we lose the house. How can you sleep knowing we're dealing with? I listened to the messages once and stopped playing them. Then Blaine called. You're destroying everything, he said. I closed my eyes. How am I destroying anything? If you had just helped, this would be over. No, Blaine. It wouldn't. He became quiet. I could hear his breathing through the phone. You have the money, he said. I earned it. You're my sister, and you're responsible for your debts. He hung up. I didn't call him back. That night, I moved my savings into accounts that only I could access. I also finished the paperwork for the small house I had been planning to buy. For the first time, I allowed myself to think about my own future without feeling guilty. I kept copies of every financial document my parents had given me. I also wrote down the dates of our conversations and saved every message and voicemail. I wasn't planning to hurt anyone. I simply didn't trust them anymore. Soon I started hearing from relatives. One aunt called and asked why I was refusing to help my parents. Another relative said I should be more understanding because I had money saved. I didn't explain everything. I didn't want a family argument. I only said, "There are things you don't know." Then I ended the calls. A few weeks passed. One morning, Dad called. His voice sounded calmer. "We found a way to handle this," he said. "What way?" "Come over. We'll explain everything." I almost refused, but I wanted to know what they were planning. When I arrived, Dad had a folder waiting on the dining room table. He pushed it toward me. "This is about the house." I opened it. It was a legal document concerning ownership of the family property. Dad pointed to the papers. "If you give us the $25,000, we'll make sure you get your money back through the house later." I read the document carefully. It wasn't what he had made it sound like. There were no simple guarantees. There were conditions and risks that could leave me responsible for money I never agreed to manage. I closed the folder. "No." Dad stared at me. "You haven't even thought about it." "I have. You're making a mistake." "No. I'm protecting myself." His face hardened. Mom sat quietly beside him. Dad leaned toward me. "You were never supposed to question us." I looked at him. That sentence told me everything. They didn't want me to understand the situation. They wanted me to obey. I stood up, pushed the folder back across the table, and walked toward the door. This time, I wasn't afraid of losing my family. I was afraid of losing myself. I didn't leave my parents' house feeling victorious. I felt empty. For years, I had believed that keeping the peace was part of being a good daughter. That night, I finally understood that keeping peace meant nothing if I had to give up my own future to do it. The next morning, I called the attorney. I explained what had happened and showed him the latest document. He helped me make sure my finances were completely separate from my parents' situation. I didn't sign anything connected to their debts, and I didn't allow anyone else to make financial decisions for me. Then I moved forward with buying my house. It wasn't the house I had imagined when I first started saving. It was smaller. There was no huge backyard and no fancy kitchen. But it was mine. Every payment would be mine. Every decision would be mine. When I received the keys, I stood inside the empty living room for a long time. There were no expensive decorations, just a few boxes and an old chair. Still, I felt proud. I had built that place without taking money from anyone. Back at my parents' house, things were changing. Blaine had to sell his truck. Then he sold some of the equipment he had bought for his business. My parents started speaking with the people they owed instead of looking for another person to rescue them. I knew all of this, but I didn't celebrate it. I didn't want my parents to suffer. I wanted them to understand that their choices had consequences. For a while, there was no contact. Then one Sunday afternoon, Mom called. Her voice sounded tired. "I think I understand now," she said. "Understand what?" "We always thought you would fix things." I closed my eyes. "That was the problem, Mom." She was silent. "We knew you saved money. We knew you were careful. We knew you would worry about us. So we kept expecting you to step in." I didn't answer immediately. Then I said, "You taught Blaine that someone would always rescue him. You taught me that I had to rescue myself." Mom started crying. "I wish we had done things differently." "So do I." There was a long silence between us. Then she asked, "Do you hate us?" "No. Can you forgive us?" I looked around my new living room. There was still a lot of work to do. But for the first time, the future felt like it belonged to me. "I might forgive you someday," I said. "But forgiveness doesn't mean everything goes back to how it was." "What does it mean?" "It means you have to earn my trust again." She quietly agreed. When the call ended, I didn't feel happy. I felt sad. I had finally gotten what I wanted all those years ago, a secure life of my own. I just never expected the price would be learning to live without the family I thought I could depend on. Several months passed before things started to feel normal again. My parents didn't ask me for money anymore. That change was small, but I noticed it. They had managed to work through their debts without using my savings. They cut expenses, made payment plans, and stopped pretending everything was fine. Blaine found a regular job. It wasn't impressive, and he didn't talk about it much, but he kept showing up. He also started paying back some of what he owed. For the first time, nobody expected me to solve his problem. Our family had changed. I wasn't the person everyone called when something went wrong. At first, that felt strange. Then it became peaceful. One afternoon, Dad called me. I almost expected another request. Instead, he said, "I owe you an apology." I didn't say anything. "I was wrong," he continued. "I shouldn't have treated you like your savings belonged to the family." That meant more to me than I expected. He wasn't asking for anything. He wasn't explaining himself. He was simply admitting that he had been wrong. A few days later, Mom came to see me. We sat in my living room. She looked nervous. "I need to tell you something," she said. I waited. "I always praised you for being responsible." She paused. "But I used that responsibility against you." My eyes filled with tears. I looked down at my hands. "That hurt more than you know." Mom nodded. "I know." "No, I don't think you do," I said. The 25,000 wasn't the worst part. She looked at me. The worst part was realizing that for years you made me feel guilty for protecting myself. You made me feel selfish because I didn't spend money the way Blaine did. Then when things went wrong, you expected me to sacrifice everything I had saved. Mom began to cry. I understand now, she whispered. I believed that she was trying to understand, but I wasn't ready to pretend everything was fixed. I love you, I told her, but things have to be different. She nodded. I made my boundaries clear. I wouldn't lend large amounts of money. I wouldn't take responsibility for Blaine's debts. I wouldn't sign financial papers for anyone under pressure. And if my parents ever needed help, they would have to ask without guilt or threats. To my surprise, they accepted it. They didn't argue. They didn't call me selfish. They simply said they understood. That was the first time I felt that maybe our relationship could become something healthier. A year passed after the night they first asked me for the $25,000. I was sitting at my kitchen table when I received a letter from Dad. I opened it expecting another apology. Instead, there was a check inside. I stared at the amount. It wasn't made out to a bank. It wasn't for a bill. It was made out to me. Under the check was a short note. Dad had written that he wanted to return something he should never have expected me to give in the first place. I held the check in my hand for a long time. For the first time, the money didn't feel like a weapon. It felt like proof that something had finally changed. I read Dad's letter 3 times before I put it down. The check was not a gift. It was money they had slowly put aside to repay me for the smaller amounts I had given them over the years. I had never expected to see that money again. At the bottom of the letter, Dad had written something that stayed with me. He said they had confused love with sacrifice. They had believed that because I loved them, I should always be willing to give something up for them. He admitted they were wrong to make me feel selfish for being careful with money. I sat at the table and cried. Not because of the check, because for the first time, my father understood what I had been trying to say. I deposited the money a few days later and put it toward my mortgage. It wasn't enough to change my life overnight. I wasn't suddenly rich. My family wasn't suddenly perfect, but I felt free from something I had carried for years. I was no longer the daughter who had to fix every problem. A few weeks later, Mom came to my house. She walked through the rooms slowly. She looked at the small kitchen, the living room, and the little backyard. Then she smiled. You really did this on your own. I nodded. She looked around again. I never imagined you would build a life without depending on anyone. I smiled sadly. Neither did I. She looked at me. I continued. I thought being a good daughter meant saying yes until there was nothing left of. Mom's eyes filled with tears. I don't want that for you anymore. I know. We stood quietly for a moment. Then she asked if I was happy. I looked around my home. Yes, I said. I'm finally learning how to be. I still love my parents. That hadn't changed. But love had a different meaning now. It didn't mean giving them unlimited access to my money. It didn't mean sacrificing my plans whenever someone else made a bad choice. And it definitely didn't mean feeling guilty for protecting myself. For years, they had called me cheap. They thought being careful meant I didn't care. Now they understood the truth. I had never been greedy. I had simply been trying to build a life where one emergency couldn't destroy everything I had worked for. Looking back, I don't think my revenge was the money. It wasn't watching Blaine sell his thing. It wasn't seeing my parents struggle with the consequences of their choices. My revenge was much quieter. I built a life they could no longer control. I kept my savings. I bought my home. I set boundaries. And I stopped believing that saying no made me a bad daughter. I didn't take anything from my parents. I simply refused to let them take anything else from me. Sometimes the strongest revenge isn't watching someone lose everything. Sometimes it's building a life they can no longer control.